Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. We're going to introduce ourselves so you know who's talking. My name is Janine Myszka. I'm a Forum Education Associate at the Museum of Science in Boston.
And I'm Penny Noyce. I'm an author and a doctor. And Susan, you're
Sorry,
mute.
I'm trying to mute my other thing and haven't figured it out. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Heilman. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the program manager of community initiatives at the Museum of Science in Boston.
All right, and today we are here to talk to you about jumping off the page, using transmedia to connect middle schoolers to current science topics. And I've once again hit too many buttons on my screen and frozen it. So Susan, if you can try to share over me for a second so I can get power back on my computer.
I'll start talking.
Perfect.
This project started when I was meeting with a colleague, or I was at a meeting with a colleague very early in the pandemic, before it really came to the US. And she and I shared our fascination with looking at worldometers and finding out what was happening with the numbers every day. Now, this friend, Jan Mokros, is very interested in teaching children about data. And so somehow we came up with the idea that I would write a book and she would create data-oriented activities for each chapter. Now, the reason we could do this is because Tumblehome Books, which I run, has a series of books called the Galactic Academy of Science. And in each of those books, a pair of middle schoolers travels through time to meet with scientists of the past as a way of understanding something that they need to solve in the present. So anyway, this is the example of the kinds of data, this is obviously net through now, that we thought children should be able to understand and look at. So you can see here what it looked like through mid-October in a number of countries. But let's go on to the next page.
So I'm actually gonna hop back just so we can get that museum perspective. We were looking to have online content, ways to engage with our audience, especially our middle schoolers. They get missed a lot with our things that we offer. We offer for elementary and early ed, and then for high schoolers, and a lot of times the middle schoolers get left out. So we're really excited when Penny kind of brought the idea to us to have this virtual book club with middle schoolers. So now I'll hop ahead and give you back the reins, Penny.
All right, so that's right. That I sort of skipped that part, but after we had done a couple of chapters, we started looking around for a way that we could actually present this to children. And by good connections, we talked to the museum, who really jumped on this so quickly and so efficiently. It was wonderful. So this is the case of the COVID crisis. May and Clinton, you've shown here, are my two middle schoolers who have gone on several time travel adventures already. And they noticed a classmate being bullied because she was Chinese, and they wanted to find out more about COVID. So their mentor from the future, Selectra Volt, takes them, gives them a pre-programmed iPhone, which takes them to different epidemics in the past, so they can start to learn what an epidemic is and how it happens and how it progresses and what you do about it. And why don't you show some of the pictures? This is that first chapter. That first picture is from chapter 1, but here are some of the examples from chapter 1. This is when May is standing up to the bully. Chapter 2, they visit the 1918 flu, where a newspaper man is trying to collect data about the number of cases in St. Louis. And we really introduced children to the idea that collecting data is really important. Then they visit May's mother, who is a nurse on the Diamond Princess. She's locked on that ship. In the 4th chapter, they learn about Nipah, a virus that is spread by bats in Bangladesh. And then they actually visit Congo during the Ebola epidemic, and then they visit a couple of countries to see how different countries have handled the pandemic. This is when they're visiting Taiwan. First they visit, this is one focuses a lot on food, baguettes and stinky tofu. The young woman presented there is actually our person in Taiwan who arranged all these illustrations. So I decided to put her in a book for once. The next picture shows Dr. Muyembe from the Congo when they had their first successful trial of monoclonal antibodies against Ebola. So really showing the way for what may happen in the US. And in the final chapter, they talk with Dr. Fauci about what to expect. That's an overview of the book. There are, as I said, activities that go with every chapter of the book, starting from doing hand-drawn sort of qualitative graphs and looking at graphs, looking at a net logo simulation, and then going on to really manipulate data using a program called CODAP.
Great, thanks, Penny. And we'll be looking at some of those activities in a little bit. We'll meet some of the characters from your book as well. We did the book club, The Case of the COVID Crisis, during April and May. So really right when this started and when everything was happening. And I think Penny said she was writing this book as it was happening. But then we wanted to see, we had some good feedback from this. We had about 60 students that were in this. Most were museum members. They were about 10 to 12 years old, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. But we wanted to see if we could replicate this. Is this something that we could take another book and do something similar to without completely starting over from scratch? And so the book we chose for this one is called The Countdown Conspiracy. We picked this one specifically because the author, Katie Slavinsky, at the time was one of our colleagues at the Museum of Science. She's actually since left the museum and to become a full-time author. She's had 4 books published. And The Countdown Conspiracy, just briefly, it's about 6 kids, about 12 years old or so, from around the world who are all selected to train over the next 10 years to be the first astronauts to go to Mars. But as often happens in science adventure books, instead of 10 years later, just a few months later, they accidentally get sent, and that's the whole, them working and trying to save themselves and get to Mars or not get to Mars and be safe and everything. So, and plus Janine and I both absolutely love space, so that's also why we chose that book. So we decided to start with the basics, with things that people were already familiar with, and not just what the rest of the world was familiar with, but also what we ourselves were familiar with, which was using Zoom webinar, or using Zoom in general. And we decided to use webinar as opposed to meeting format for a couple of reasons. One, we were dealing with minors, and we wanted to make sure that we respected all their privacy and didn't necessarily want to have to get permission slips and releases and everything for that. So this way, we never actually saw any of their faces. We got to know them really well, but none of actually seeing their faces in these. And also having 60 and then eventually 90 to 100 kids in these, having a meeting format was just too difficult anyway. So we went with webinar. And then we also used Google Classroom, which when March and April rolled around, I was just getting to learn working with my elementary school son, because that's how he was interacting with his classes and his teachers and his friends. So here's an example of what our heading of the Google Classroom looked like. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but there's different pieces. There's stream, classwork, and then we ignored the grades, and then the people I would just use to sometimes contact them. The stream was really great for being able to connect with the students. They used it a lot more than I ever thought they would at talking to each other. By the end of the book club, we were watching rocket launches together, and they were exchanging books that they loved to read. And so it became a bit of a community, and I liked Google Classroom for that. Each week, our classwork consisted of, and this was across, so this is where it's across the board for both Countdown Conspiracy and COVID Crisis, where we would assign reading each week, we would assign an activity, and we would assign some questions. They never had to like hit turn in or submit, we weren't grading, but for the answering the questions, there was a Google Slides deck that all of the students had access to, and they would make their own slide. And that was where we started to be able to encourage their creativity in what they did. We'll show some examples in just a minute of that. But I like the simplicity of the Google Classroom setup for their tasks each week. So we did have some ability to do research and evaluation for a Countdown Conspiracy. We did a teensy bit with COVID Crisis. Since then, Penny and Jan, who she mentioned, have done a little bit more as well. And we'll mention those results at the end, but we have a lot more evaluation that we can talk about with Countdown Conspiracy. Basically, this was just, this slide here is showing that it was well moderated. They felt comfortable asking questions. That was really important. Overall, the format worked for most of them, and it did encourage creativity. So that's the green in all of these. So this was nice just to see we were doing it well. Although I will say the caveat is, of the 88 regular kids we had in Countdown Conspiracy, we got 24 to fill out the survey. And it's very not only possible, but likely that these were the kids who already loved what we were doing. So we're going to get a lot more positive comments from them. So here's the transmedia approach that we came up with. And Penny and Jan and Janine and I and some of our colleagues kind of used these here and there throughout both of these book clubs. The biggest one that I became a huge fan of was polls. I'll show in a moment, though, that students loved polls so much. They loved working with them, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. We had a lot of guests, almost, I'd say, half to every week. Countdown Conspiracy, I think every week we had a guest, and we had a guest at least half the time in COVID Crisis. The homework slides, they surprisingly didn't mind that much. Although this was in the spring when they didn't have much schoolwork, and the summer when they didn't have any schoolwork. We had a podcast, several different kinds. We'll give an example of that in a little bit. And the podcast not only gave extra information, but also introduced living characters to them. We'll talk more about that. And then the activities you heard from Penny were very data driven for COVID Crisis. And then in the second one, we tried to make them very STEAM driven. We tried to have a lot of that art and artistic and creativity included in there. So with the polls, so the favorite parts of the book club. Reading the book was the favorite. That was great. That's what we hoped for and would expect. But they loved the polls as well. This was a tab where they could select as many different things as they wanted. And these are the top choices. Answering the questions and making their slides, and then listening to and talking to the guest speakers. So we'll talk about each of those briefly. So for the polls, each week we started each lesson with some polls where it was just, where are you in the world or country or state? And we had, in the first one, we had one person from another country. In the second one, we had 3 people because they were abroad for the summer. Actually, I think one lived in Britain, actually. And we had people all over the country, but of course, very focused in the Boston area. Most of them were museum members. Then we asked some getting to know you questions. What's your favorite food, favorite topping on a pizza, favorite ice cream, favorite planet, things like that. And it was really fun. They loved responding. It was anonymous, so those students that might not be the ones to raise their hand or volunteer information could easily click a button. And we usually got 90 to 95% participation in the polls. But then we also used it to encourage our discussions. Sorry, Janine. We used it to encourage our discussions. with each other. So when we asked some of the questions that they had their homework questions on, they weren't testing if they read the book, but they were more like, well, what would you do? How would you have reacted to this? Who would you most relate to in the book? And we shared a lot of those answers through their slides, but also, again, to get large amounts of information and get as much participation as possible, we would ask those questions during the polls as well. Okay, and then one of our favorite parts as well was definitely having the guests. So what you see here, the other author, Katie Slavinsky, is the one in the middle bottom. That's Penny on the bottom right or bottom corner. Penny's husband is actually, if you don't mind me mentioning Penny, Penny's husband, he's an infectious disease expert as well, and he came on during COVID crisis. The top right is Larry Madoff, who's the head of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, or one of the main people, Department of Public Health, also a friend of Penny's, and so he came in to talk about COVID. The top two are, actually the top middle is a NASA engineer, and the top left is a planetary scientist. We'll talk more about her in a minute. But as I said, the students loved interacting with them. We usually gave them about 10 to 15 minutes to answer questions from them. Some we would unmute them and they could ask themselves, and others they would type in the chat. And any leftover questions, our guests were so amazing. They spent time and answered every single question, and we emailed them out to the students. So to talk a little bit about the planetary scientist, about Allie there, we also asked them at the end about how their careers interests may have changed based on this book club. Now, unfortunately, we weren't able to do a pre-poll or pre-survey for this. We only had a post one. That's something we hope to remedy in the future. So this is students, the gray area is prior to the book club, I was interested in this career. And then since the book club, I became interested. So they had to remember back to before the book club. So taking that with a grain of salt. So you can see here though, that a third of them went from not being interested to being interested in a career in planetary scientist, or a few in mechanical engineer, systems engineer, because those were, I think it's because those were the guests that we exposed them to during these sessions. At least two of the students asked personally to be connected with the planetary scientist, actually one with the planetary scientist, one with the mechanical engineer. And they followed up with them to answer some questions for them because they became really interested in how to further go with that career. And then also we found that the guests also gave them more of an understanding of what was necessary around the science, specifically for a Mars mission. So for example, they didn't realize ahead of time that studying geology would be a huge piece of being able to go to Mars. So we had a planetary geologist, and then you can see here, most of them, all of a sudden, you can see the light bulb go on in this data where, oh, you do need to study geology to be able to go to Mars, or someone in the mission needs to be able to understand geology. And so we also asked about overall about what lessons they may have learned. And it wasn't about educating them, it was about inspiring them to want to know more about these topic areas. And so each week we did either with a guest or on our own, we would give them more general information about Mars, about programming, about Antarctica, because that's actually where the students were training in the book. So we talked a lot about what that would be like. Being an author, the author came on, Katie came on and did a whole how to write a book session at the last one as well. So we saw that they did have an increase in their, in what topics they learned about. And they didn't have to be proficient at it, they just learned about it. So on the homework slides, we only did anywhere from like 3 to 5 questions. And again, they ranged from, if you see on this one, this is from one of Countdown Conspiracy, about how they would react to things. Do they get nervous like they did? Were you suspicious of something happening? In the data club ones, COVID crisis, we would ask, well, would you gargle with salt water to prevent coronavirus from happening? Or how would you have reacted to inoculating, if you were George Washington, to inoculating your troops against smallpox? What would you have done? And so they would then make their own Google Slides. Now, again, because of privacy issues, we're not going to show you their slides. They're just going to show you, this is one of mine, and I'll show you a couple others of my colleagues. And these are pretty bland ones. They would put GIFs on theirs, little videos, they'd put jokes on theirs. They would make different fonts and different, it was creativity incarnate. And we were really happy to see that, because we didn't want it to be a homework lesson, a homework session. We wanted them to have some fun with it and to think about it. And sure, some students just did, you know, black writing on white background, but a lot of them really had fun, and they would even comment, oh, so-and-so, I loved your slide, or I love your cat picture, or something like that. So it was another way for them to express themselves and to communicate with each other. Again, without needing to worry about violating any minors' rights or getting permission around those areas. And then one of the last sessions, oh, right. Another great section that, I don't know, Penny, do you want to talk for a minute about why you decided to use podcasts of the characters involved in this?
Well, the kids were reading the books. I wanted to help with a sort of connection to what it was that we hoped they were learning about data, because the book is an adventure story. It's not full of instructions. And I wanted to connect the data stuff to the real life. So I thought the best way to do that would be to have Clinton and May discuss each trip they've been on when they come back. And luckily, my partner's son was able to recruit 2 young students for us to do the voices. So on top of writing the chapter and getting illustrations and creating questions and activities each week, we also had to write up and record a podcast each week with everybody distant from each other. It was quite a task.
So I'm going to play just the beginning of the podcast for a minute. And this also goes along with the living characters. So not only did the podcasts give some extra information, sometimes there were little lessons or little tidbits in there that you couldn't get from the book. It also gave a voice to May and Clinton, and it introduced and it allowed us to have the voice of yet another character from the book and really come alive. So I will play, and I hope you'll be able to hear all of this. Also, we didn't mention earlier, but if you want to be putting any questions in the Q&A or the chat of Huva, please feel free to do so, and we'll be taking those in a little bit. So here is an example of the podcast section from chapter 4, the one with the bats, which was almost everyone's favorite chapter.
Whoa, Clinton, you're a mess. You look froggled.
If you mean all scratched up, yeah, thanks. I scraped my way down a date palm.
How did you like the bats?
They were kind of scary. Huge.
Cute faces, though, until they showed their teeth. And to think they're carrying a disease
Nipah.
that puts people into a coma.
It's weird to think that it gets from bats to people in 2 ways.
Okay, and so then we actually use that to talk about the zoonotic virus and viruses going from animals into people. But I'm not sure if you were able to recognize, you haven't heard us talking that long, but if you were able to recognize that other voice in there besides May and Clinton, we also had Selectra Volt join us, and we're lucky enough to have her here today.
She's the teenager from the future that acts as the guide to the middle schoolers and gives them their missions.
Thank you very much, Penny, for having me. And Susan, I'm so excited to be here. Zwiffy, as always. You did such a wonderful job documenting my life and all of my adventures and teaching all these kids. I love being a dudette. I'm from right around now, and I'm a teen, and absolutely totally normal, don't time travel at all. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about this whole book club and being part of it and getting to meet the kids every week and see what they were saying and what they were talking about was helping them with their activities. So we had a lot of activities that we did for our Case of the COVID Crisis book. And we have pictures from 3 of them. We were very STEM focused. So we wanted to teach kids about data and data literacy and to understand how things work. So in the upper left-hand picture, you'll see a contact tracing activity we had the kids do to figure out how many people they were coming into contact with, and then how many people those people were coming into contact with, so they could really understand what this bubble was that everybody was talking about, and how viruses can spread, and how much time you kind of need to be around people for finding out about these you know, pretty amoeboid things of viruses spreading in general. In the right-hand corner, you'll see a graph. I believe this is from the code app that Penny mentioned earlier. So having kids take the data, turn it into graphs, and then interpret those graphs was one of our activities. And in the bottom center, you can see an activity we had them do with a deck of cards about learning about R0 and how fast a virus or infectious disease will travel, and how the R0 affects that. So the higher it is, the more people get infected, and the faster your cards will all turn into infected people. And then they had the chance to kind of think about, oh, well, this is what happens if everybody just keeps infecting forever, but what about vaccines, or what about immunity? So there were different ways that they were able to take that activity and expand on it. But here's an activity for you all to do. Hopefully there's enough of you hanging out here in the chat. You can try to match a graph to a country. So this is actually an activity we did have the kids do. We had some graphs with a couple clues about what those places might be in terms of their population and their land size. So if you know a lot about your countries, you'll have a good guess of which one belongs to which. But we also wanted them to be able to look at the graphs and the trends and interpret those and what those might mean. So tied to each country is a headline, and that headline is then reflected by the graph. So you might look at South Korea tests 10,000 people each day. Which one does that go with? Does that go with A or B or C? And so we had them go through all of those. I don't see any answers coming in the chat, so I guess I'll just give you all the answers. Oop. And so you can see that that South Korea one was actually E, but the United States on March 26th leads the world in confirmed COVID cases. So, you know, just noticing data trends there. As we mentioned, for that countdown conspiracy book, which I had absolutely nothing to do with and didn't do any activities for at all, because I am Telectrovolt and I'm from the future and I didn't do that. But Janine did. And so there were activities that were kind of blending this STEM, STEAM, all of it together. We had them design mission patches for the mission, and you can actually see Janine's is in the bottom left corner, and I believe Susan's is in the top right, and then our colleague Sarah's is that triangle one in the bottom. We also had them make Scratch programs, so they were doing coding, and some of them had used Scratch before, so they knew a lot about how that all worked. It was fun to see how they interpreted the same activity differently. It was a lot of fun. We didn't limit it to digital activities. We had them design their own robots. And unfortunately, as Susan mentioned earlier, for privacy reasons, we can't show you the picture of the robots that they actually built. Some of them used Lego Mindstorm, some of them made sculptures. It was pretty cool. This is the one that Janine made, HAL, the Helpful Assistance Lender. I'm not sure how many students got the joke there, but it tickled her. So I think that I can pass it back to you, Susan.
Yes, great. So some of the results from COVID crisis, as I said, this was a little bit of work that we had done at the museum, and then some work that Penny and Jan had done. They ran a camp in Maine using the book and using a similar methodology. And it showed that the students became more interested in COVID-19, more interested in data science, more interested in immunology. And so that's kind of the learning parts that we really wanted to test them for. But we were also thinking, this was Penny's kind of overarching idea, is if you know more about something, does it become less scary? And so it did show many of them became less anxious about the pandemic. None of them became more anxious about the pandemic. Some were, kind of in the middle. Sorry, my meeting disconnected on Whova, so I lost that for a second. They became more confident in their ability to use and interpret graphs, and that was really one of the biggest overall successes that they wanted to see, because this was part of a data club. And they became more interested in epidemiology. One time, one of the guests we had, one of our 10-year-old students raised their hand and asked if they could, I forget exactly what it was, but it was something about, can you talk about the epidemiology of coronavirus versus that of the epidemiology of measles, or what?
Of flu, the regular flu.
And they just pulled out like the epidemiological, I can hardly even say it, and hearing these 10-year-olds asking questions about it in their cute little voices was just absolutely amazing. That was a real win for us, I think, that they were asking intelligent questions with that. And best of all, they said they really enjoyed the experience. It was overall very positive. For the museum's case, we had at least a dozen, if not about 20 students come over from the first book club to the second book club. We talked a lot about the results we saw from Countdown Conspiracy, so I won't put too much here. But basically, they wanted to read more. It either somewhat or greatly, and even at least minimally, increased their interest in reading more science adventure books. And so that was something we really just wanted to see, that they were very excited about this and about this whole project. And then I think, so if you want to start your own book club, we're absolutely happy to help. We'll put our emails on the last page. Basically, you'll need a book, a technology platform, whereas we use Zoom and Google Classroom. You'll need an audience, a way to recruit that audience, a way to get them together. We recommend 2 staff, a moderator and a producer. In some cases, we sometimes had 3 staff people, but I know that might be difficult to do, but 2 is really important, 1 to talk and 1 to moderate things. And then the activities. So whatever you want to talk about with the book, whatever inspires you with it. And those other things like podcasts and guests, those definitely added to it, polls, but none of them were wholly necessary. They were just the things that we felt increased the enjoyment, not only for the students, but for us as well. And as I said before, we're absolutely happy to help plan with these. We're working with a group called Imagine Science, and they're running after school programs and using the COVID crisis book. And we have a whole workshop arranged around how to use COVID crisis in a book club for an after school program. And you can make it be 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, an hour each. And we're even exploring different levels of technology applications or technology that they have, the different types of technology they have. And then I think on the last slide, Penny, if you want to just talk for a minute of what else, I just briefly mentioned this, but if you want to mention other things for the case of the COVID crisis that you're thinking of.
Yes, we did take the case of the COVID crisis and write it into an NSF grant proposal, but while waiting to hear whether we get funding, we are already taking the program out to new partners. We're about to start on Monday a club with the Lewiston 4-H, Lewiston, Maine, and as Susan Heilman said, we're working in 4 cities with a combination of different youth serving organizations as an after-school program. And one of the things that we've realized is that as the pandemic continues, there are more issues that come up. And so we'll write at least 2 additional chapters. One will be on racial disparities with the kids visiting a Navajo reservation. And we have some great data about ethnic disparities and think it's something that kids late in the program could really discuss. And then we'll probably do one about vaccine distribution, because that's another kind of challenging and interesting thing for the kids to think about.
And so for the museum, we'd love to be able to do this with other books. Katie Slavinsky has another book that I just love about the super volcano at Yellowstone, which also I think would just make for a really great one of these as well. But I think we've seen that it's a model that we can, even though we only have an N of 2, it's something it seems like we can replicate. It seems doable from what we have. And we've been able to optimize it for a certain amount of staff time. We're also hoping for more diverse audiences. That's true for the Museum of Science across the board, especially so in our last book club, it was, so we had almost 90 kids and it was over 70% white. So we know that we are reaching a very specific type of audience. And we're hoping to pair with other groups like the Boston Public Library or other community partners to try and reach a more diverse audience. And this Imagine Science that we're working with, these after school programs, those are over 90% with students who are, I believe it's at or below the poverty line, I think is the way they classify.
Free and reduced lunch, I guess. Yep. And very diverse. And one group is all girls. Yeah, the one thing I forgot to say is that we did create an activity guide, a facilitator's guide for the case of the COVID crisis, which is available for free on our website or by writing to tumblehomebooks.org. And I don't know if you've done that for the Countdown Conspiracy, Susan, if you've sort of written up what you did.
We don't have a facilitator guide, but we do have like a general guide about how to run the book clubs overall, and then all of the activities for each of them as well. We have all the activity guides and questions are all aligned together. So it is something we haven't totally formalized yet.
Yeah,
but that's also available. So if there are any questions, please feel free to put any of them in the, I know if you want to either use the chat or the session Q&A on Whova, we're happy for those to take those. You can also see our email addresses on here. We're happy to have you email us if you'd like any other information, anything to brainstorm about it. We're happy to do that as well. It's something that we had a ton of fun with, and we felt that it was, relatively speaking, easy to do. For the amount of payoff that we got from it.
And I'll just say before I take this slide down and let our faces show when you ask us questions that this picture is from Mars. This is a sunset on Mars. So had to let you know about that. Alrighty.
Thanks. So if there are any questions, not seeing much of any here, but that's totally fine. Think about if there's anything else that we want to add that people have asked us in the past.
We could say maybe like what our favorite thing was about doing the book club.
Could do that. I missed the students. I was looking through all their slides. We had twin girls at one point who were very different from each other, and their slides were very different from each other, and we loved that. And then siblings that were 10 and 12, and we could see similarities and differences. Sometimes they worked on their robot together and created like the family robot. And then there were, like I said, there were about 20 of them that went from the first book club to the second book club. And so even having never seen their faces, I hope that someday when we're back in the museum more, I'll be able to meet some of these kids in person, because I really like them a lot and miss them.
I agree that hearing the kids' voices was the most fun part of the program. And since they were turned off for most of the time, it was also a rare part of the program, but very enjoyable. And I will also say that this program really underlined for me one of the things that I'm really trying to do with all my writing and with Tumblehome books in general, which is to capture for science those kids who love reading and to capture for reading those kids who love science. So their enthusiasm was a great reward.
I think my favorite thing was seeing them do all the activities that I helped create and seeing how they took them. We do have a question in the chat. So Erin is wondering, have you thought about transforming this for history museums who want to get into STEAM? And I think that's for you, Penny.
I haven't thought about that, but that would be great. If you're a history museum and want to figure out how to do it, get in touch. Because all our gas books have historical aspects and try to have kids visit different countries in different times with diverse characters. And I also think that science and technology are often sort of underrepresented in a history class. So thinking about how to bring them in would be really interesting.
I think it's the one chapter that really comes to mind is we got to meet Dr. Boylston and mention Cotton Mather. And so that was a really cool section because it was about Boston and everyone knows Boylston in Boston. And so that was a really cool section to hear about that part. So I think it's something that would translate really well, the COVID crisis definitely into a history museum. Absolutely.
I would say that we asked the kids what other chapters they would like to see, and they really wanted the Black Death in medieval Europe. But there wasn't a lot of data about that, so it didn't really lend itself to data activities, but I think they wanted the ghoulishness of it. Yeah,
I think so. Also, so someone else also put in the chat, how young do you think this could go? Some children's museums have interest in doing programs about COVID. You know, especially with how facile I think kids are getting with things like Zoom and Google Classroom. Normally I would have said my son was on the young side for the ability to do a lot of this. He read the book and he loved it. He's 9. He was 8 at the time. I think you can go to like a 7 or 8. The part that doesn't lend as much younger is if you want them, I felt like doing the slides and the activities and that type of participation was important to feel like more like a community to each other. And that might be harder the younger you go. But I think my son every day, again, he's 3rd grade, he has to do a slide every single day about something. So maybe in this day and age, 2nd or 3rd grade might be okay. And it depends if you have the parents buy-in. That's something that, you know, families can do together. I know that's stuff that Penny definitely thought about, is families being able to talk about these together. Contact tracing was a family type activity that we had in this. So I think it definitely could go a little bit younger, but you just have to think about how they're going to use Zoom or Google Classroom if those are the platforms you go with.
Yeah, I think it depends on what book you choose. We think of our books as they're written at a 4th grade level. We think of them as working for grades 4 through 7 or 4 through 8 particularly well. But if you wanted to do a one-time book club, you could do it around a picture book or something like that instead of doing something that ran several weeks. So I think there are a lot of different ways to do this. Take this idea and run with it.
Yeah, I could see doing like a story hour with a kid's book like this, especially if like the reading comprehension is really your what's preventing kids from participating. But I do think I have seen some picture books come out about COVID actually. I feel like that's a thing that's out there. So if you had one of those for early learners and just had like a story time at the virtual museum, and then let's do an activity together, and maybe send an email to the parents ahead of time, hey, get a ball and some pipe cleaners and we'll make a model coronavirus together or something like that. That could be a fun activity for the little ones. Diane, I'm not sure what you mean about exploring manufacturing, but if you want to write more about that, I think it would be an interesting book to go through the story of manufacturing. There's a lot to explore in that topic, both in the advancement in technology and also the impact on the world for good and also maybe not so good.
Sure, I could write a manufacturing book in partnership with someone.
So if there's not any other questions here, in patents for silk manufacturing.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, and someone else added a cute book about coronavirus from Maine. Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, and we like to think that our procedure could be used for maybe not any book that exists, but that it is something where you can take a lot of different types of books and use at least the format that we came up with. Because by the end, so we did 9 weeks of COVID crisis, 5 weeks of countdown conspiracy. We got into a rhythm where we needed X, Y, and Z for each event for each book club to happen. It was a 1 hour a week or 45 minutes a week for the longer one. And we just knew we could do X, Y, and Z, and then we were ready and we had it implemented. So maybe I'd like to think that with any book that you choose, that you'd be able to fit it into kind of the process that we've used. Okay, well, I think we're in the day and age here where if you want 15 minutes back in your life, we can give you that 15 minutes. And so you have our email addresses. We hope to hear from any of you that would like any ideas. I'd love to think about, with a history museum or something like that. So take your few minutes back. Penny or Janine, do you want to wrap up with anything? Or, oh, Janine's back. It's not Selectra anymore.
Yes, I have the correct name for myself. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that you got inspired, learned something. We certainly had a lot of fun running these and would recommend highly for anyone else to try to take on.
I agree. And you have so much to offer as museum educators. You know how to engage the kids and keep them going, and you know the content. So you can really enrich their learning during a time when in some ways it may seem rather impoverished.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And then I think we have Dan, if you're still here, I think you can end it if you want to say anything, or we're over here. Thank you all.
Turn us off.
Thanks, everybody. So long. Great job.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, Dan.